The previous presentation compared two different ways that the mind can form a concept of God. This presentation will examine how the mind forms concepts of people and how these mental concepts guide habits, social interaction, and culture. We will begin by looking at three situations involving an interaction between people and mental concepts of people. Suppose that my mother has a stroke, and that this stroke changes her personality. There will now be a discrepancy between my mental image of my mother and the way that she behaves. I will realize that she is not the same person that she used to be. Such a discrepancy is deeply unsettling. This tells us that we expect people to behave in a certain manner, and it affects us at a deep emotional level when there is a mismatch between our mental concept of a person and the actual behavior of that person. Moving on, consider the situation of a girl playing with a doll. Even though the doll is not alive, the girl interacts with the doll as if she is interacting with a living person. This suggests that the girl is actually interacting internally with the mental concept of a person, and that the physical doll is being used to represent this internal interaction. Similarly, what is happening when one goes to a grave to remember a departed loved one? The physical person is dead and gone, and yet the person visiting the grave does so for social and emotional reasons. This implies that even though the real person is dead, the mental concept of that person still exists within the mind of the grieving spouse, and the grieving individual is coming to the grave in order to interact with the mental concept of the dead person. But if the mental concept of a person resides within the mind, then why does the girl need a plastic doll? And if the grieving individual is remembering the mental concept of a loved one, then why does this require visiting the gravesite? The mental network, or MN, provides a possible explanation for what is happening. It can explain how habits develop within the mind, how the mind forms concepts of people, how cultures functions, as well as providing an explanation for the agency detector described in the previous presentation. I have come across many authors, both religious and secular, who describe something similar, and the mental network provides a simple mechanism that explains these various descriptions. In addition, evidence from neurology strongly suggests that the orbitofrontal region of the brain functions in a manner that is consistent with the idea of mental networks. The mind attaches emotional labels to memories of experiences. One could represent a memory as a circle and the emotional label as an arrow pointing up or down. A mental network forms whenever there is a collection of similar emotional memories. The memories within a mental network will then respond as a group. If one memory within a mental network is triggered, then this will bring to mind all of the memories of the mental network. When a mental network is triggered, then it will generate an emotional drive to reproduce the content of that mental network. This means that a mental network generates two kinds of emotion. There are the emotional labels of good and bad being applied to individual memories within a mental network. And there is also the emotion of same and different being generated by the mental network as a whole. A mental network that experiences compatible input will respond with a positive emotion. In contrast, if a mental network is triggered and it receives incompatible input, then this will lead to a sense of unease. Feeding this network by providing it with compatible input will remove the sense of unease, while continuing to face the mental network with incompatible input will cause the sense of unease to grow, strengthening the urge to find compatible input. If a mental network is faced with incompatible input for a long enough time, then it will eventually fall apart and revert to being a collection of isolated memories. If a mental network forms out of a collection of painful memories, then there will be an emotional conflict between the emotion associated with the individual memories within the mental network and the emotion generated by the mental network as a whole. For instance, suppose that one lives with an abusive spouse. These emotional experiences will lead to the formation of a mental network. The individual memories of this relationship will be painful, but the pattern of response will also be familiar. Therefore, remaining within the relationship will feel bad because the experiences are unpleasant, but it will also generate a positive emotion because the mental network is receiving compatible input. In contrast, leaving the relationship will generate pleasant experiences, but it will also face the mental network with incompatible input, leading to a sense of unease, which will generate an increasingly strong drive to return to the familiar pattern of the abusive relationship. A habit provides a simple example of how a mental network behaves. New experiences acquire emotional labels based upon the existing mental networks that they trigger. For instance, the Marlboro Man was used for many decades to sell cigarettes, but the mental networks being triggered by the typical Marlboro Man ad had nothing to do with smoking. Instead, they brought to mind mental networks involving the Wild West, the rugged independent man, and living in touch with nature, in order to emotionally affect the way that a person would feel about smoking. Suppose that one starts smoking. The procedures and experiences of smoking will then form a mental network, causing the behavior to sustain itself. One will probably not realize that a mental network has formed, but simply view smoking as something natural, that is an aspect of normal existence. The presence of a mental network usually becomes obvious when one chooses not to satisfy the mental network, because it will then stop receiving compatible input. For instance, suppose that one decides to quit smoking. One will then find that desire overrides choice. It is usually possible to use free will to defer satisfying a mental network, but it is much more difficult to decide not to satisfy a mental network once it has formed. Continuing with the example of smoking, the more one tries to stop smoking, the stronger will be the urge to smoke, and choosing to light up will immediately bring a sense of emotional relief. However, if one continues to suppress a habit for a long enough time, then the mental network will eventually fall apart and the habit will be broken. Choosing to satisfy a habit during a period of withdrawal will bring relief in the short term, but it will also lengthen the time that is required to break that habit. Breaking a habit is not the same as not triggering a habit. If a mental network is not triggered, then this may give the impression that the habit has been broken, but the mental network is still present under the surface, waiting to be reactivated by some trigger. A habit is truly broken when one can be exposed to experiences or words that used to trigger the habit without feeling a desire to carry out the habit. Neurologically speaking, all addictive behavior appears to involve the neurotransmitter dopamine. Brain research makes it clear that wanting is not the same as liking. Desire is different than emotion. Desire is associated with dopamine, while emotion comes from memories and from mental networks. Free will can be used to suppress small mental networks. However, when a mental network becomes strong enough, then it will override free will, and one will only be able to choose to delay satisfying this mental network. The only way to overcome core mental networks is by building an alternative set of mental networks and then choosing to satisfy the new mental network instead of the existing one. Saying this more simply, conflicting mental networks enable free will. As the picture of the two dogs illustrates, when there are conflicting mental networks, then the mental network that is fed will grow at the expense of the competing mental network. Social interaction is also guided by mental networks. One can illustrate this with the help of a simple example. Jack is sitting at the computer, browsing the web, and something catches his eye. He sees the picture of a pizza, and this brings to mind a mental network composed of various experiences, smells, and tastes related to eating pizza. This mental network creates a drive to experience compatible input, prompting Jack to say, "Jill, what if we make pizza?" Saying the word pizza triggers a mental network within Jill's mind, which is that the last time they made pizza, it burnt, leading to an unpleasant experience. Motivated by this unpleasant collection of memories, she starts to respond, "The last time?" These three words are sufficient to remind Jack of the unpleasant experience, and he responds by saying, "Do not worry, we will order pizza." Ordering pizza provides his mental network of eating pizza with compatible input without triggering the mental network involving the burnt pizza. Notice that communication between the two is occurring at three different levels. First, there is the explicit communication in which each is interpreting the words of the other. This occurs because both Jack and Jill are able to speak and understand English. Second, the words being spoken by one are triggering mental networks within the mind of the other. For instance, when Jack says the word pizza, then this reminds Jill of the unpleasant experience involving pizza and burnt crust. Third, mental networks are being used to predict how the other person will respond. Thus, when Jack says that they can order pizza, he is responding in a way that he hopes will satisfy Jill's mental networks. The mental network that dominates a conversation will depend upon the context, the emotions, and the available choices. For instance, when I gave this example to a group of ESL teachers, one of the responses was that this example reflects traditional gender roles, because Jack is at the computer and Jill is in the kitchen. Thus, the illustration as a whole triggered a mental network representing typical male and female behavior. Mental networks are also responsible for creating a sense of culture. One can define culture as a collection of mental networks that are shared by a group of people. Culture is self-reinforcing because each individual within a culture is driven by the mental networks within his mind to behave in a certain manner, and this behavior provides compatible input for the mental networks of other individuals within that culture. Most of the mental networks of a culture are acquired automatically during childhood through the normal experiences of life, and the average person within a culture is not consciously aware of the mental networks within his mind that drive culture. He simply feels that it is natural to think and behave in a certain manner. A mental network becomes obvious when one compares one culture with another. For instance, in both of these illustrations, a black boy is attending school. However, attending a village school in Africa will lead to a completely different set of cultural mental networks than attending a city school in America. The two black boys may look the same, but they are internally driven by a different set of mental networks. Shared traumatic experiences are very effective at creating or enforcing a culture because the trauma will create a common mental network that is shared by many individuals. For instance, 9/11 was a watershed experience in American society. It both solidified American culture and altered the course of American culture. A shared goal is a more positive way of building a culture. The mental networks of a culture are implicitly enforced. When a person acts in a way that is inconsistent with the local culture, then this provides mental networks in surrounding individuals with incompatible input, prompting them to respond in a way that either rejects the behavior that is different or else enforces conformity. This is especially true within children's minds, who instinctively regard same as normal and good, and different as abnormal and bad. The mental networks of a culture are not always obvious. For instance, it is obvious that these three young men belong to the same culture because they are all wearing Sikh turbans. But what is less obvious is that these same individuals are also being motivated by the broader culture of teenage youth, because they all wear sunglasses, jeans, and a t-shirt, and they all portray the sullen attitude of today's typical youth. The mental networks of culture become most obvious when they are violated. This may happen when someone from another culture visits and behaves in a strange way, or when one travels to another culture and encounters strange behavior. Obviously, a mental network can only be triggered if it exists. For instance, when the typical Western individual visits a Sikh temple, the visit may feel exotic and unusual, but it will probably not trigger any strong mental networks because the average Westerner has not had many emotional experiences with the Sikh culture and religion. In contrast, someone growing up in a Sikh household will have strong mental networks associated with that culture, and symbols and rituals from this culture will trigger these mental networks. As a result, the individual looking at a culture from outside will often wonder why the people within that culture respond so strongly to certain experiences and symbols. Saying this more generally, it is much easier to analyze the mental networks of someone else's culture than it is to analyze or even recognize the mental networks of my own culture. Culture shock occurs when a person attempts to live in a strange culture. Suppressing a habit for a while is easy. However, the longer one tries to suppress a habit, the more difficult it becomes. Similarly, culture shock does not occur immediately when one visits a strange culture. Instead, the sense of unease brought on by unfamiliar experiences will gradually grow over time. The person feeling culture shock will feel strongly driven to withdraw to a familiar environment in order to feed the mental networks of culture with consistent input and avoid facing them with inconsistent input. However, if a person goes through culture shock, then a new set of mental networks will form, making it possible to feel comfortable within the new culture. This pattern of withdrawing to familiar surroundings can be seen in the expatriate compounds that Westerners construct in foreign countries, as well as the Chinatowns that Chinese populations often construct in foreign cities. These expatriate communities will often be indicated by prominent gates and signs that trigger familiar cultural mental networks, as well as by walls that prevent unfamiliar mental networks from encroaching upon the familiar environment. Whenever two mental networks are triggered at the same time, then each will attempt to impose its structure upon the other. To some extent, this struggle can be guided by free will, but usually the mental network with the strongest emotions will win this struggle and impose its structure upon the weaker mental network. As a result, mental networks will naturally form an emotional hierarchy, and the mental networks with the strongest feelings will act as core mental networks that impose their structure upon the rest of the mind. The strongest mental networks within a person's mind are usually the mental networks representing mother and father. That is because children grow up physically and emotionally dependent upon parents for safety and well-being. Saying this more simply, a person will naturally think and act in a manner that is consistent with the thoughts and actions of parents. Teachers and other authority figures are also sources of potent mental networks, and these mental networks will also impose their structure upon thought and behavior. Finally, defining experiences such as major traumas or significant joys will also create potent mental networks that impose their structure upon the mind. These core mental networks will define the behavior of a person because they have the emotional power to impose their structure upon all lesser mental networks. A mental network only imposes its structure if it is triggered. If a mental network is always being triggered, then it will be impossible to ignore. One can define personal identity as the collection of mental networks that cannot be ignored. Mental networks of identity are not usually the ones with the strongest feelings, but they are impossible to ignore. For instance, one can immerse oneself within some movie and identify temporarily with the hero or heroine, but when the movie is finished, then the mental networks that cannot be ignored will reassert themselves, restoring one's true sense of identity. The primary source of personal identity comes from the physical body, because the body is a continual source of emotional experiences, and it is impossible to ignore one's physical body for an extended period of time. One can pretend for a while when sitting in a comfortable chair that one is the person portrayed on a movie screen or in a book, but eventually one's physical body will bring to mind the mental networks that represent the physical body. As one grows older, personal identity will also be defined by knowledge and skills, because these are represented by mental networks that are consistently present. For instance, if I know how to fix cars, then this knowledge will be repeatedly present whenever required, and it will form part of my personal identity. Finally, there are the mental networks that are triggered by the context. Most of the mental networks of culture belong to this category, because traveling to a different culture will trigger a different set of mental networks. Friends are usually represented by mental networks that have some emotional strength, which are occasionally triggered, and a person will often behave in a different manner when with different friends. Habits also depend upon the context, and one can often suppress a habit fairly successfully by ensuring that the mental network is not triggered. However, as was mentioned before, breaking a habit is quite different than not triggering a habit. Notice that the mental networks to the left of the dotted line all represent people and the behavior of people, while the mental networks to the right of the dotted line involve experiences and physical objects. Because the same cognitive mechanism of a mental network is being used to represent both people and objects, it is possible to treat an object as if it is alive. For instance, we saw this in the example of the girl interacting socially with a plastic doll, treating the object of a doll as if it is a living person. Summarizing, the mind appears to be controlled by a hierarchy of mental networks. Most people are aware of peripheral mental networks, and they can use choice and environment to control these mental networks. Behind these lie the more fundamental networks of personal identity, which are much more difficult to analyze and change. Behind these lie the core mental networks that act as the emotional foundation of the mind. When these core mental networks fall apart, then a person experiences what philosophers call angst, which is an uncertainty at the very core of one's being. Mental networks cause people to behave and interact in specific ways. We have already seen that the childish mind naturally regards same as good and different as bad. This leads to peer pressure, in which one feels emotionally driven to act in a way that is consistent with the behavior of one's friends. Peer pressure requires the presence of mental networks. In order to feel driven to behave like someone else, a mental network that represents that person must exist within my mind. For instance, I will feel driven to conform to the behavior of my friends because my mind contains mental networks that represent these people. Similarly, if advertising can create a mental network within my mind, then I will feel driven to conform to the structure of this mental network. Every mental network feels good when it experiences compatible input. We saw in the previous slide that the mental networks of personal identity are usually not the strongest mental networks. Therefore, mental networks of personal identity will feel pressure from stronger mental networks to conform to the structure of these stronger mental networks. For instance, in some cultures, parents place strong pressure upon children to enter certain professions, such as becoming a medical doctor. When mental networks of personal identity do conform, then these stronger mental networks will respond in a positive emotional manner because they are receiving consistent input. This is indicated externally by the giving of applause and approval. This means that approval can have both external and internal benefits. When someone pays me for providing a service, then I am receiving an external form of approval from that person. When someone applauds or recognizes me, then I am receiving an internal form of approval from the mental networks that represent that person. We saw that mental networks form an emotional hierarchy within the mind, and that the mind uses mental networks to represent people. This internal hierarchy leads naturally to a society in which people interact based upon domination and submission, with each person acting in a way that conforms to the expectations of those who are above him. One sees this officially in the typical business organization, as well as unofficially expressed through pecking order. Experiences of pain and pleasure from the physical body naturally form mental networks, but mental networks only exert emotional pressure when they are triggered. The end result is that the mind of the average individual contains a hodgepodge of disconnected habits and physical urges that are randomly triggered by input from the environment, such as the sight of a delicious slice of cake, triggering a desire for sweet food. Because mental networks only impose their structure when they are triggered, the natural tendency is to try to avoid mental networks by running away from them or by avoiding discussing certain topics. For instance, posting a sign, "Do not push button," will paradoxically increase the urge to press the button, because the sign is specifically triggering a mental network which then has to be suppressed through the use of free will. If such a sign is not present, then the average person will probably not even think about pressing the button. When mental networks continue to receive inconsistent input, then they will generate a strong drive to be satisfied. In the same way that pain in one part of my body will cause me to ignore the rest of my body, when some mental network within my mind is being denied, then it will emotionally cry out for attention, causing me to ignore other mental networks. My social interaction with others will then be driven by my need to satisfy my unfulfilled desire, and I will ignore mental networks that represent other individuals. In other words, my personal emotional needs will make me oblivious to the needs of others. In contrast, social interaction is normally guided by what is known in psychology as theory of mind, in which one individual uses mental networks to guess what is happening within the mind of the other individual, triggered by physical clues such as body language. For instance, the lady on the left is trying to guess whether the lady on the right is angry, and the smile on the face of the lady on the right will probably trigger a mental network of pleasant interaction within the mind of the lady on the left. We have looked at mental networks from a purely psychological perspective, and we have described behavior that naturally emerges from mental networks. We will now examine these traits from a moral perspective in two different ways. First, we will examine the long-term impact of this type of interaction. Second, we will look briefly at what the New Testament says about this behavior. Mental networks drive people to seek the approval of others. This is an inadequate method of guiding behavior for two primary reasons. First, approval is unstable. Standards of approval can and do change. For instance, the first picture shows Lenin preaching to vast crowds, while the second picture shows a statue of Lenin being toppled. The same individual that received great approval eventually received great disapproval. Second, approval can only judge the external. People can only see how I behave, and they must use theory of mind to guess what is happening within my mind. But behavior is ultimately driven by mental networks which are internal and not external. Therefore, approval will always deal with symptoms rather than causes. Using an analogy, approval is like attempting to plug a leak. One can plug the hole and prevent the water from escaping, but one cannot eliminate the pressure that is forcing the water through the hole. Turning to the Bible, John 12 says that, quote, "Many even of the rulers believed in Jesus, but because of the Pharisees they were not confessing him for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God." End quote. One sees here that a desire to receive approval from people was preventing people with social status from seeking approval from God. Mental networks also lead naturally to interaction based upon domination and submission. This is inadequate because it leads to a societal structure in which the strong oppress the weak, a metaphorical food chain in which the big gobble up the small. Matthew 20 describes two of Jesus' disciples coming to him with their mother to ask for power and status in the kingdom of Jesus, and the rest of Jesus' disciples becoming indignant because they did not think first about playing the political game. Jesus responds by saying that Christianity is not guided by domination and submission. Quote, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave." End quote. Mental networks lead naturally to hedonistic behavior, in which habits and desires are satisfied when they are triggered. This is inadequate because seeking short-term gratification usually leads to long-term painful results. For instance, the right side of the picture indicates a normal person's face, while the left indicates the typical face of a smoker. Similarly, 1 John compares the love of God with the love of the physical world, pointing out the temporary nature of mental networks based upon physical urges. Quote, "All that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away, and also its lusts, but the one who does the will of God lives forever." End quote. Moving on, whenever two mental networks are triggered at the same time, then they will struggle for emotional domination. This internal struggle will express itself naturally in external strife and struggle. The ultimate expression of this is murder and war, in which one person or group of people attempts to silence opposing mental networks by destroying the physical bodies that house the opposing mental networks. James 4 describes this externalization of internal conflict and calls it hostility toward God. Quote, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel." End quote. We saw that the individual who is focusing upon protecting his own mental networks is incapable of acknowledging the mental networks of others. The end result is that one can feel alone in a crowd, because everyone within the crowd is focusing upon satisfying their own mental networks while ignoring the mental networks of others. In contrast, fellowship acknowledges the mental networks of others and attempts to meet the needs of these mental networks. Philippians 2 contrasts these two ways of thinking, encouraging people not to think merely of themselves, but rather to think also of others because of the emotional benefits of fellowship. And it points out that God rewards those who go beyond trying merely to protect their own mental networks. Looking at this from a positive perspective, I suggest that the goal should be to achieve an integrated mind in which all of the mental networks function in a consistent manner. Similarly, 2 Corinthians 10 says that even though we live in a physical world, the ultimate struggle that we all face is the internal struggle of submitting all mental networks to a mental concept of God. Quote, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ." End quote. Summarizing, mental networks naturally drive people to behave in a manner that is fragmented and self-destructive. One can reach this conclusion either by observing people or by reading the New Testament. I mentioned earlier that the Christian Bible appears to contain the most accurate analysis of the core of human behavior. This slide provides an illustration of that statement. We also saw in these quotes that the Bible contrasts the natural behavior of mental network with behavior that is approved by God and submitted to a concept of God. I suggest that one can explain approval from God in terms of mental networks by expanding the concept of mental networks. The previous presentation compared two ways of forming a mental concept of God, and I suggested that these two ways are mentally driven by two kinds of internal detectors, an agency detector and a theory detector. What we have described so far in this presentation is the mechanism behind the agency detector. In other words, we have examined how the mind uses mental networks to represent agents such as real people, invisible people, and imaginary people. However, I suggest that the mind actually contains two forms of mental networks, one responsible for the agency detector and the other responsible for the theory detector. The mental networks that we have discussed so far are all mercy mental networks, or MMNs. The term mercy refers to the cognitive style of mercy person, who is conscious within the part of the mind that remembers experiences and assigns emotional labels to experiences. One can study how mercy mental networks behave by examining the thinking that is conscious within the mind of the mercy person, and studying the behavior of the mercy person provided the initial data that helped me to come up with the cognitive mechanism of a mental network. This concept was then fine-tuned by reading what others said about the topic. As we have seen, mercy mental networks are used to represent people, emotional interactions with objects, as well as providing the basis for culture. The mercy person is not the only cognitive style that lives within a world of emotions. The teacher person is also emotional, but teacher emotion is based upon understanding. When the proverbial light goes on top of a person's head, then this is an indication that one is experiencing positive teacher emotion. Mercy thought works with experiences, and MMNs are constructed out of emotional experiences. Teacher thought, in contrast, works primarily with words, and words and symbols form the building blocks for general theories. All general theories exhibit order within complexity. Using the analogy of the monarch, they are composed of some monarch who rules over a set of subjects. For instance, algebraic equations are general theories because variables such as x and y are being used to represent many specific items such as apples and oranges. A language is also a general theory because a general structure of words is being used to describe many situations and events. Science has discovered that mathematical equations can be used as general theories to describe physical events. For instance, we saw in the previous presentation that the equation E equals mc squared explains the explosion of an atomic bomb. Finally, theology is also a general theory that can create positive emotion. And I suggest that the general theory of theology can explain how the mind works. When a mental network is triggered, then it will impose its structure upon the mind. A teacher mental network will also use emotional pressure to impose its structure when it is triggered. This expresses itself as a desire to interpret a situation in terms of that general theory. For instance, I feel emotionally driven to use the theory of mental symmetry to interpret many topics, such as social interaction or theology. A mercy mental network forms when there is a collection of similar emotional experiences. Similarly, a general theory does not turn instantly into a teacher mental network. Instead, a mental network will form within the mind when a person continues to use a general theory for a long enough time. This explains why the typical university professor thinks differently than the average person on the street. A university professor has worked with general theories long enough for these theories to turn into teacher mental networks. This means that there are actually two kinds of culture shock. When a person travels to a different culture, then the unfamiliar experiences will face the mercy mental networks of culture with incompatible input, leading eventually to a feeling of culture shock. Similarly, when a person encounters a new paradigm or general theory, then the unfamiliar explanation will face the teacher mental network of existing general theories with incompatible input, leading eventually to the abstract cultural shock of a paradigm shift. In other words, new experiences will threaten existing MMNs, while new theories will threaten existing TMNs. When one is dealing with strong mental networks, then free will requires a set of conflicting mental networks between which one can choose. Saying this more generally, one can only replace core mental networks with other core mental networks. This principle applies to both mercy mental networks and teacher mental networks. As Thomas Kuhn says, once a person acquires the teacher mental network of a general theory, it becomes very difficult for that person to return to the mental state of not having a general theory. Instead, a scientist can only let go of one paradigm if he is given an alternative paradigm. Saying this another way, when the mind contains two opposing sets of mental networks, then personal transformation becomes emotionally possible. We have seen that the mind is naturally driven by mercy mental networks of culture and identity acquired through the experiences of childhood. I refer to these as childish MMNs, and Piaget describes the thinking of the typical childish mind. We will examine that in the next presentation. We saw in a previous slide that childish MMNs lead naturally to unpleasant consequences. It is possible to replace the MMNs of childish experiences with the TMN of a general understanding. When one acquires an understanding, and this understanding turns into a TMN, it then becomes possible to choose to follow the mental network of understanding rather than the mental networks of childish desire. This is portrayed in the New Testament as a struggle between flesh and spirit, and often illustrated by a little angel and a little devil sitting on the shoulder of a person. The end result of replacing one set of mental networks with another is not the suppression of desire, but rather the formation of a new set of desires. I have suggested that a general theory that applies to personal identity will form a concept of God, written with a capital G. Using the language of mental symmetry, in the same way that a collection of emotional experiences will naturally form an MMN and be interpreted as a finite individual, so a general theory that turns into a TMN will also lead to the concept of a universal being. A mental network will only attempt to impose its structure if it is triggered. Similarly, a universal understanding that turns into a TMN will only attempt to impose its structure upon personal identity if this universal understanding is triggered by personal identity, which will only happen if this universal understanding applies to personal identity. Luke 10 describes what it means to be emotionally attached to a concept of God that applies to all aspects of personal existence. Quote, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." End quote. We saw in the previous presentation that there are many different kinds of general theories, and that not all concepts of God lead to beneficial results for the individual person. Using religious language, not all concepts of God save the individual. Saying this in terms of mental networks, suppose that one gains a general understanding of how the childish mind behaves. If this general understanding turns into a TMN, then it will reinforce childish behavior, because teacher thought will feel a positive emotion of understanding when a person behaves in a childish manner. This is what happens when a person constructs a mental concept of God in their own image. The end result is not rational thought, but rather rationalization, using understanding to explain and to excuse childish behavior. Saying this more generally, whenever two mental networks collide, then each will attempt to impose its structure upon the other. This sort of emotional structure occurs between MMNs, and it will also occur between the MMNs of identity and culture and the TMN of a concept of God. This conflict will force a person to choose between forming a concept of God in the image of self or allowing a concept of God to impose its structure upon identity and culture. The second option will lead to a sense of sin before God, because the TMN of a universal understanding is making the MMNs of personal identity feel inadequate. We saw in the previous presentation that Christianity is based in theology. Using the language of mental networks, Christianity is held together by the TMN of a general understanding of the nature of God and how a universal God interacts with finite individuals. I suggested earlier that the goal should be to reach mental wholeness. I have discovered that if one pursues this goal of mental wholeness, then the concept of God that emerges within the mind is consistent in detail with the concept of a Trinitarian God as described in the Bible. This relationship is explored in much more detail in the book Natural Cognitive Theology. This ends the second presentation. Thank you for watching. More information can be found on the website www.mentalsymmetry.com.